We are looking this morning again at the book of Joshua, and we're in chapters 3 and 4 of Joshua, and find there a very instructive portion of the story of Joshua as he endeavors to be obedient to God and to move the people of Israel into the promised land flowing with milk and honey. Let's just review our progress. As we looked a couple of weeks ago at the initial verses of Joshua, we saw God calling him to be strong and courageous. And we saw that he was being called then by God to go and begin to live the quality of life that God had in store for him, which involved crossing the River Jordan and defeating the citizens of Jericho and then inhabiting the land. Joshua then took 5 steps to heart, and you'll just remember this as a review. He saw from God's word what he was to do and then how he was to do it. And then he heard from God words of encouragement that told him he could in fact do what he was called to do in the way he was called to do it. So he knew what to do and how to do it. He knew that he could do it, and so he decided to do it. And then all the rest of the book of Joshua is the 5th step. He begins to do it. And last week, as we saw him sending out spies into the promised land to scout out the land, especially Jericho, we saw then that as he began to do the things that God called him to do, he proceeded intelligently and systematically and carefully. It was a matter of care to send out the spies, and he was following in the footsteps of Moses, who was commanded by God to send out spies when they first had the opportunity to enter the land. So we see that the living out of the Christian experience is a matter of proceeding in faith, but proceeding intelligently and systematically and carefully. And so they did that as far as they could do that. And this morning, as we look at chapter 3, we find out what happens to the believer committed to intelligently and systematically and carefully obeying God when he runs up against something which he cannot deal with in that normal, natural, intelligent, systematic, and careful way. All right? Joshua, in verse 1 of chapter 3, rises early in the morning. He and all the sons of Israel set out from their camp, and they come to Jordan, and they lodge there before they crossed. Now we're told later in this chapter that it's the harvest season. That's the barley harvest season. That's the springtime. And the mountainous areas around have lost their snow to the heat of the spring, and the river is in flood. So the people have committed themselves to going out and inhabiting the land, and they proceed doing the careful, systematic, intelligent thing until they come to a point which they cannot go past. And in this case, it was the River Jordan. They got there with their wives and children and animals and the Ark of the Covenant and the tools and utensils of the tabernacle, and they couldn't go any further. So this morning, we ask ourselves a question: what next? If you are committed to obeying God and you're proceeding to live out the Christian experience in an intelligent and systematic and careful way, what happens when intelligence and systems and care is not good enough? What happens when you come to a barrier which you cannot cross? I hope you're thinking practically about the aspects of your life that are equivalent to crossing the Jordan. I hope you're thinking of areas of life, aspects of the Christian life that God is calling you to, which are equivalent, which call for the same sort of faith, the same sort of strength and courage. And then perhaps you can imagine in your own life an equivalent to the River Jordan. Maybe you can think of something which you are not able to get across, something you're not able to accomplish on your own. Then you're in the same position as they were. They picked up their tents and their belongings, and they moved right to the edge of the bank, and then they could go no further. Well, what did they do? I think the answer to the question, which we'll see as we study this chapter, is this. The question, what happens when you can't do the next thing? The answer, if you're sure you have God's word on it, then you simply go as far as you can go until you can go no further. Now, it's very important that you've got that first clause. If you're sure you have God's word on it, then you go as far as you can go until you can go no further. Now, they had no reason to doubt. They had no shadow of a doubt that, in fact, God was calling them across the river. In chapter 1, verse 2, God had said, "Arise and cross the river." So they had God's word on it. They knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were obeying God, and that makes all the difference. You mustn't apply any of these principles in a doubtful area. If God has not made his will entirely clear to you through his word, then you can't apply these principles. But if you know you're walking in obedience, and you know you're doing what God is calling you to do, and you're doing it in the way that he's calling you to do it, and you're committed to doing it, then as you approach that barrier, whatever it is, emotional, psychological, physical, or spiritual, you just go as far as you can until you can go no further. And then you do 2 things. You wait, because you can't go further. You wait, and you do not forget to get terribly excited. Because you see, when you're obeying God and you go as far as you can go and you get to a point where you can't go any further, you go as far as you go until you're stopped. You just wait for God to do something next, and you should be excited about it because you're in one of those rare moments in life where you know God is about to work. I hope you've got some experience that you can relate to that. I can think of a few times in my life, not many, but a few times in my Christian experience where I knew I was obeying God and I was coming up to an unpassable barrier, a barrier that I could not get over, and I knew that God wanted me to go beyond, to continue on in this pursuit, and I was tremendously thrilled about the whole thing. Because although my life seemed to be in a great period of uncertainty, there's no uncertainty with God. And I knew that God was about to do something really spectacular, something as far-fetched as parting the waters of the River Jordan to make the next step possible. And this is what the position Joshua was in as they went as far as they could go, and then they went no further. There they were on the very brink of the river, and they couldn't go further. It was in flood. It was rapid. In these days, the Jordan River in these parts, for 70 miles, have 27 rapids in them. It's a very rapid-flowing river at any time, and in flood season, the whole thing is rapidly flowing. It would have been suicide to go any further, so they went as far as they could, and then they stopped. But they didn't just stop and wait. I mean, they did absolutely everything they could do before they stopped. In verses 2 to 4, we see that. It says it came about at the end of 3 days. They waited 3 days that the officers went through the midst of the camp. Now the officers do everything they can. So they commanded the people, and they said, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God with the Levitical priests carrying it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it. However, there shall be between you and it a distance of about 2,000 cubits, 1,000 yards by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. You could say that they're calling for people to keep their distance because of the holiness of God. But that's not it, because they were allowed to be close to it all along. This distance wasn't required before. The distance of 1,000 yards was required between the ark and the people because they were going somewhere they had never gone before, into the promised land. And there was 2 million of them. And God was ensuring that no one would miss the point. So the people went out and said, get ready. It's going to happen. It's got to happen. God's called us to arise and cross. So get ready. We're going to rise and cross. When you see the ark going, stand back and watch it because God doesn't want you to miss it. You've never been this way before. You've got to see how God does it. See, they're on the brink of a whole new thing. And perhaps you are too. If you're walking in obedience to God, and yet in this one aspect of obedience you can't go any further, realize God's about to do something new. And that's a tremendously exciting thing. You're going to see something new. You're going to see something you've never seen before. In this case, only Joshua and Caleb had ever seen this before. They were there in the Red Sea when it parted. This whole new generation had only heard about it. Now is their opportunity to experience it. Maybe you're in that position too. You see what God needs to do. You know it's happened for other people, but it's not happened for you. Well, get ready. It's going to happen for you too. Stand back and watch God work and get ready. Joshua also does absolutely everything he can do. He doesn't sit back and say, well, there's nothing more I can do until he's done absolutely everything. And so in verse 5, he announces to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And that's very important as well. He thinks to himself, here we are, we're camped on the river, we've got to cross the river, we don't know what God's going to do. Is he going to supernaturally lower a bridge? Is he going to do what he did at the Red Sea and part the waters? Is he going to make us all water walkers so we can glide across? Is he going to equip us with boats from heaven? We don't know, but God's going to do something. He's not done this before for us. And then he thinks, if God's going to do something among us, we better be the people that God is pleased to work among. So he says to the whole people, consecrate yourselves. Set yourselves apart for God's service. Do all that you must do to be holy. And he was calling them to confess their sins, and he was calling them physically to wash their bodies and their clothing, and to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and spick and span and ready for God to do something. And there's something in that for us, you see. If we're on the brink of something new and we're waiting for God to do something extraordinary, then we better be ready for the extraordinary. We better consecrate ourselves, both by dedicating ourselves entirely to God, focusing on him and his word, and also by entirely removing ourselves from the stain and the iniquity and the contamination of the world. We've got to get ready. We've got to get ourselves prepared to be the people among whom God will work. Now you can imagine how the people in anticipation hit the laundry tubs and the wash basins and got going on this chore. They were washing themselves up because the Lord was going to do wonders among them. And the excitement was spread throughout the camp. We're on the brink of it. God's got to do something. Watch what he's going to do. Do you know what he's going to do? I can't imagine what he's going to do. You think he'll do like the Red Sea? Well, maybe he'll do something new. They didn't know, but they were getting pretty excited about the whole thing as they waited to see what would happen. And I hope we too are excited about the things God's going to do for us. As a church and as individual families and as individual Christians, we wait for God to do new things among us, to take us to new levels of the Christian life. I'm going to rearrange the next couple of verses because I think it works better and I think that the grammar allows it. Go to verse 7 and 8 and realize that the Lord, somewhere along the line, said to Joshua, that's a past tense, it could be a perfect past, the Lord had said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. You shall moreover command the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, saying, when you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." And I think, in fact, chronologically, that took place before verse 6. Because then Joshua spoke to the priests in verse 6, saying, "Take up the ark and cross over ahead of the people." So the priests took up the Ark of the Covenant and went ahead of the people. And then in verse 9, Joshua calls to all the sons of Israel, says, "Come here and hear the words of the Lord your God." Watch what's going to happen. Joshua said, "By this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will assuredly dispossess from before you all the people living in the land that we're going to take over. Behold, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over ahead of you into the Jordan. Now then, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man from each tribe, and it shall come about when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, and the waters which are flowing down from above shall stand in one heap." They knew what to do. It was to rise and cross. They didn't know step 2 here, how to do it, until God came along and said, "Here's how it will happen. The priest will lead the way. The priest will lead you through the waters. The waters will part." So then Joshua immediately calls to the people and says, "Get up and get ready and watch for this. God's going to do it." And he knew what would happen if they were obedient. Verse 10, "By this you shall know that the living God is among you." Now that's a relative thing, because they already knew that the living God was among them. But he says, now you'll know it in a whole new way. You watch what God's going to do now, and you'll see in a whole new way. You'll sense in a whole new dimension that the Lord God is among you. And I know from my own experience, and imagine from yours, that that kind of knowledge is just what we need right now. No matter where you are in your Christian experience. If we could only know in a whole new way, if we could only realize with a new depth that the Lord our God is among us, then wouldn't we begin to go out and live a new dimension of living? I mean, wouldn't it make a difference if the Lord was able to somehow peel back our indifference and our lethargy at whatever levels we're indifferent and lethargic, and show us in a whole new way that the Lord our God is among us? What if he were to send an angel to announce it? What if he were to drop down a note from heaven? What if there were to be writing on the wall? Mene, tekel, the writing on the wall. What if a trumpet blast? What if the Lord would do something to show us in a whole new way that he really was among us? It would change us, wouldn't it? For some of us, it would be like a slap in the face. We'd say, wow, it's true. I've always sort of said it's true. I've always sort of believed it's true, but now I know that it's true. Well, God is not likely to use a trumpet blast or handwriting on the wall or a note from heaven. That's not the way he generally works. The way he generally works is he calls us to obey him. And when we obey him, he reveals himself through our obedience. And that's a principle of the New Testament as well as the Old. And if we recognize that we need a whole new knowledge of God, if we need to be impressed in a new way that he's among us, here's what you do. Get more obedient. Obey God in a new way. And he will show himself to you in a new way, and you'll know in a new way that he is here with us. John 14:21 is the New Testament verse that says that best. John 14:21. He says, Jesus says, "He who has my commandments and keeps them," all right? You've got his word and you do it. He's the one who loves me, and he who loves me I will love, and my Father will love him, and we will manifest ourselves to him. The one who has Christ being manifest to him, the one to whom Christ has manifested himself, is the one who has his commandments and keeps them. So you want more of God? Do you want to be more clearly impressed with the reality of God in your life? Then it's a very simple thing. You take his commandments and you keep them. In this case, the priests and Joshua and the sons of Israel were to start marching towards the water and trust him to show himself to them in a whole new way. Now, what this chapter is all about is the relationship between faith and obedience. Because they were the people who had gone on record as being believers. They were ones who had faith. Faith and belief, the same word, you understand. They were believers. And now they were called to obey. And we want to explore this a bit and see the connection between faith and obedience. Because some of us are not being obedient because we say, I just don't have enough faith. I don't believe enough. And some of us, in fact, don't have enough faith because we're not obedient enough. And so we say, don't look to me to be obedient. I need more faith. Well, God is saying, don't look to me to give you more faith. What you need is more obedience. Think about the relationship between faith and obedience. You know what it's exactly like? I think it's exactly like the relationship between the chicken and the egg. You know the old chicken and the egg joke? You're probably about 8 years old when you first heard that. Some uncle came to visit and he says, well, son, what came first, the chicken and the egg? And you thought he just made it up. You say, that's easy, Uncle Dan. The chicken came first. How else did the egg get there? And then your Uncle Dan, looking so wise, says, where'd the chicken come from, son? You go, oh, yeah, right. Chicken came from an egg, Uncle Dan. He says, right. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? And you say, oh, I see it now, the egg. He says, where'd the egg come from, son? So I get it, the chicken. And you discover that there's no answer to that unless you resort to a Bible study of the book of Genesis and see, of course, the chicken came first. God made the chicken, and the chicken laid the egg. But that's beside the point, and Uncle Dan never talks about that stuff. What's the relationship between faith and obedience? What comes first, faith or obedience? The chicken or the egg? Well, let's think about this. For sure, we can say that faith demands obedience. Faith demands obedience, and that's one of the relationships between the two. You can't have faith without obedience. Faith demands obedience. So we find in the book of James that practical correction to all sorts of misconceptions. James saying, you say that there is one God. You believe that there is one God. Well, good for you. The devil believes that too. The demons believe that too, and they do something about it. They tremble. But don't you know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? That trusting God without obeying God, faith without works, is useless? Any kind of faith which is real faith results in obedience. Find yourself a guy who says, I have faith, but doesn't obey God, and you found yourself a guy who's kidding himself, or you, or somebody who's doing something wrong. You can't talk about having faith without obedience. Faith demands obedience. And these people saw this here, didn't they? They were being called to trust in the Lord. And their trust was demonstrated by the fact that they're willing to march straight towards a flooding river. Faith demands obedience. But on the other hand, obedience demands faith. Because how are you going to obey God in the things that He calls you to do if you don't trust Him to enable you to do those things? And it's interesting that at this point in Israel's history, very early in their adventure in Canaan, God so arranged things to make that point abundantly clear. He so arranged it that they saw very clearly that their obedience demanded faith. If they were going to demonstrate their faith by their obedience, still they had to have faith in order to be obedient. For how could they obey God and cross the Jordan without trusting Him to do something with that Jordan, either quickly turn it into concrete or quickly evaporate the waters or something? So there's this chicken and egg relationship between the two, you see. God calls you to have faith, and faith demands obedience. So He's calling you to obey. But obedience demands faith. You can't obey God in the difficult things He calls you to do unless you believe. And so over and over again in our minds, we keep coming back. I need to believe, well, then I need to obey. I need to obey, then I need to believe. And it's a very interesting thing. Now, when you think about this story and what God has done in these people's lives, you realize that the onus is really on the priests. I mean, it was the priests' turn to be on the spot. The other people would have a chance later on to do other difficult things, but for now, it was the priests who we really should talk about. Not even Joshua was called to do what the priests were called to do. They were called to pick up the Ark of the Covenant and to proceed across the river. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was a box 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet, roughly. It had rings on its legs. It had little legs at the bottom, and had rings on the legs so that poles could go through the rings, so that 4 men could carry the Ark. The poster shows 2 men. That's because the artist is so inept, he didn't dare try to go 3-dimensional. But there's 4 priests, and they've got 2 poles, and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And then the Ark has a very heavy lid, and it has a sculpture of 2 cherubim on top, and the entire thing inside and out is overlaid with gold. And then inside this gold box, 4 feet by 2.5 by 2.5 feet, are the 2 stones, 2 rocks, that Moses carried down from the mountain with God's 10 commandments written upon them. To Israel, the significance of the ark was what it symbolized. To Israel, the significance of the ark was what it symbolized. It symbolized God's presence, which is why it went first. But to the priests, the significance of the ark was not what it symbolized, but rather what it weighed. They were not nearly so impressed with the fact that it demonstrated God's presence as they were impressed with the weight of the thing. It must have weighed a ton. It was a box of wood, overlaid inside and out with gold, with a big gold lid, and 2 angels in gold on top, and 2 rocks inside, and 2 gold-covered poles. And they picked up this thing before they were obedient to the command to march across the river. It was just the sort of thing you didn't want to be holding on to with 3 of your buddies when you're called to walk across a flooded river, right? So the significance of them was that God was calling them to do something which was really difficult. I mean, it'd be different if he said, strip down to your Speedo and swim across, boys, and they trusted God to help them swim. But here they were trusting God to help them carry an immensely heavy object across the river. They were on the spot. And it's very interesting to see how God got them out of it as we explore the relationship between faith and obedience. Were they willing to obey? Well, that willingness would come from trust in God. They could only obey if they trusted. But did they really trust? Well, we don't know unless we find out that they obeyed. Look at verse 14. It came about when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant before the people. And when those who carried the Ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the Ark were dipped in the edge of the river, and then there's this little interruption to make sure you don't miss the point. The Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of the harvest. It says, don't forget, the river's flooded. I mean, it's not 3 to 10 feet like it usually is in depth. Now it's like 20 feet deep. That the waters which were flowing down from above stood and rose up in a heap. You see that? It came about when those who carried the ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the ark were dipped in the edge of the water, that the waters which were flowing down from above stood and rose up in a heap. God didn't need to do it like that. He could have said, stand back and wait for something spectacular to happen, boys. And they could have stood on the banks and waited for the river to stop. But he didn't say that. He said, go ahead, walk. If you trust me, walk. And so they started to walk with this immensely heavy box on their shoulders. And not until their feet were wet did the water start to part. And you've got to really sympathize with the guys in front. Because they're walking down an incline into the river, right? And it wasn't until the priests' feet were wet. They got two plurals there. You got multiple priests, multiple feet. Which means the guys at the back need to get their feet wet as well. Or they wouldn't, it wouldn't be the same thing. So the front guys are walking forward, hoping that this ark really is only 4 feet long, as the guys at the back are not wet yet. And they're a little wetter all the time as they walk forward until the guys at the back get their feet wet. But it wasn't until all four had the feet wet that the water parted. You see that? And so for a couple of amazing moments, they're walking in faith. And it must have been terrifying, because there was no indication that God was going to pull through, except that God had said he would. And it wasn't until all of them were standing up there, the guys in the back up to their ankles and the guys in the front up to their knees, that the water suddenly separated. It happened 20 miles up. Something about the sovereignty of God there and the control God has over the whole world. Something happened up in the city of Adam, it says, and the waters were cut off, and all of a sudden it was dry ground. But it didn't happen until they took the steps of faith and began to trust God, demonstrating their trust and their faith by obeying. And verse 17 says, the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan. Now you get this picture. The priests walk right down into the middle of the riverbed. And if the water was to return, they'd be like 20 feet down. And they're holding on to this big box. It's like holding on to an anchor while the water's temporarily been dismissed. And they waited for the children of Israel to cross. Now we think of that like, they're gone. But we're talking 2 million men, women, and children with their oxen and their ox carts and their plows and their stereo cabinets and everything that they wanted to take with them, right? This is not a short thing. They're standing there with their big heavy box with the water behind them, gurgle, 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 sort of just hanging around there. God's holding it back, and they watch. For the space of time it takes 2 million people to cross a river. You ever been on a Sunday school picnic and the guy gets up on the picnic table and says, all right, now everybody down to the ball diamond is just down the field. How long does it take 100 people at a Sunday school picnic to make it across a park? 20, 30 minutes, right? We say, what did he say? When? Hold on, I'm talking to this guy. Well, we got 2 million people here, and you got to get them all across the river. It must have taken a long time. No one demonstrated faith through obedience like those priests, who stood there with that heavy object on their shoulders, wondering how long a river can stand on its edge, and finding out that it can stand on its edge just long enough. It says they waited while all of Israel crossed. God showed them something about faith. It must have been the most terrifying moment in their lives. But can you imagine when they're old men looking back, talking about the lives they lived? Can you imagine what event they kept coming back to? It was the most exciting time of their lives. Same thing, wouldn't it be? They say, man, I was scared stiff back in those days. But man, was that exciting. Standing there, seeing God do something that he had never done in my generation before. That's the way it is for us. When we really have to trust God, there's such a tremendous excitement about it, as God begins to show us and allow us to know that the living God really is among us. Well, the story's not over yet as we dip into chapter 4 for a little bit. The priests are there watching all these stragglers go across the river. And the river was wide. It was about 100 feet wide in normal time, so it could have been 200 feet wide. It was a long stretch of land. It was covered in rocks and fish flipping around and all that sort of stuff because the water wasn't there anymore. People finding old fishing lures and stuff that had been long gone, Pepsi bottles and stuff in the bottom of the river. And so people were picking things up. And when the last one was finally across, the priests are going, glad this is almost over, right? Yeah, glad this is over. And then, it says in chapter 4, it came about when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan that the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe. Joshua had already done that. And take up for yourselves 12 stones from here out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm. Atta-go, boys, the feet are still standing firm. And carry them over with you, and lay them down in the lodging place where you lodge tonight. The 2 million people made it across, and the priests are already breathing a sigh of relief because it's all of a sudden, it's almost all over. And then Joshua says, 12 men, go get the 12 biggest rocks you can carry and bring them across. So 12 guys, they had to be identified. They're in that mess of 2 million people. They come out, they walk across, however it was, half the width of the river. They look around for rocks. What about that one? Oh, what about that one? 12 guys trying to find their favorite rock. And then, when they pick it up, you notice that they don't walk as fast anymore. So you got 12 guys walking like this. And all the priests are going, it's not over yet. It's not over yet. And they're waiting all this much longer, you see. That's very interesting. To see that God wasn't in any particular rush to end this special moment. He kept them in faith. He kept them needing to trust God, clinging to their faith for quite some time before it was all over. And the 12 stones were used as a memorial to the fact that God had done something amazing. And while those 12 men were doing that, you know what Joshua was doing? Joshua went down into the river too. And he picked up a number of stones, and he made his own little altar right where the priests were. Very interesting. In a few moments' time, the priest would come up out of the water, and then the river would return. And who would ever see the stones again? No one. The writer says, if you had the time to read chapter 4, and they are there to this day, which is very interesting. It would be possible in the next generation to bring your kid to the side of the river. So you see that river, well, way out there in the middle, if you could dive down, you'd find 12 stones drowning. And your mom and I would have drowned right where they drowned. I mean, your mom and I would have been buried in the water just like those rocks are buried in the water, except that God came through. You see, son, you can trust and you can obey God. It was a powerful lesson, although it was an invisible lesson of what God is able to do. Now, I want you to think of how you can apply all of these principles, because it doesn't do us any good if we don't apply it. But the truth is you can apply it to any aspect of obedience to God, any area of life. You can apply it to marriage and all the problems involved in 2 people learning to live together according to God's will. It may be that God has given you a role to play. You see it very clearly in Scripture. But you can't see fulfilling that role in your marriage because of the uncooperation of the other partner. Maybe it's just like that God is calling you to go ahead and demonstrate your trust in God by assuming the role that you need to assume in faith, that God will somehow take care of the flooding all around you, somehow take care of the other part that you can't do anything with. Maybe it has applications to your personal life. God is calling you to a deeper level of abiding in the Word. And that means going out on a limb and beginning to do some Bible reading or some Bible study that you're not sure about. Maybe God is calling you to get involved in small group study, and you're so shy and you're so afraid that someone's going to ask you to do something like speak in public that you're reluctant to get involved. And God is saying, be strong and courageous. Trust me. Go ahead. Take this next step in your pursuit of the knowledge of my Word. I can't help but see many applications to us as a church. As we dabble with the renovations and so on, we're taking our first steps in becoming a different church than we are. And it's just interesting to see how it works. God says, take the next step. And hasn't He, through the fund, given us enough money to take just the next couple of steps? And we're not even sure we can finish, but we're sure we can start. And so in obedience, we say, well, all right, we'll get our feet wet. And we'll trust God to part the waters. There are many applications. But the application that fits in best is the one that I want us to dwell on for just a little moment before we close. There's one application that is better to make than any other because it applies to every one of us who believe at one point in time, and it's in fact pictured by the miracle itself. And that is the commandment to be baptized as a believer. Now, if you have been baptized as a believer, you can sit back in your smug indifference and say, glad that one's over with, and realize that there may be another flooding Jordan just ahead in another area. But if you have not been baptized as a believer, I want you to see that you're just in exactly the same position as Joshua was when he and the people were on the wrong side of the river. Because Joshua had the commandment, arise and cross this Jordan. And we have the commandment, believe and be baptized. Mark 16 puts it that clearly, believe and be baptized or you shall be saved. The Bible links baptism with believing. All right? And there's the commandment. And now you know what to do. And I think you know how to do it. You fill out a pew card and say that you're coming out Thursday night to the baptism Bible study, which will prepare you for baptism on March 23rd. And you've got to know that you can do it, and you've got to decide to do it. Then you've got to do it. So see you out Thursday night, eh? It's the very same thing. You know, it's just like Joshua's experience. He proceeded in an intelligent and careful and systematic way until intelligent, careful, systematic action wasn't enough. And then what did he do? Well, he just simply gritted his teeth and obeyed God. It may be that the idea of believer's baptism strikes you as a contradiction to intelligent living. It's not a very intelligent thing to do. I mean, whoever heard of moving the pulpit out of the way and on a Sunday morning having the pastor wade up to his chest in water? I mean, if you're a Baptist, this is no big deal. But if you're from a non-believer baptism kind of church, this does strike you as weird, doesn't it? The pastor is going to take you and say a few words over you and get you soaking, dripping wet in front of a whole bunch of people who are dressed in their suits. And then you stand there and you're all wet. And there's something unintelligent about that. Does it not seem so? Perhaps in a different way it doesn't seem intelligent, in the sense that you're doing fine as a Christian, and you know it's just a ceremony, so why bother with it? I mean, you know, why not just act like intelligent adults and go with what works? Well, God is calling us to be baptized as believers, and if we haven't been baptized as believers, we have this commandment, and there it is. It may seem to you unsystematic, because perhaps you have a system of theology carefully worked out which says that adult believers do not need to be baptized. You know the systems I'm talking about. Some of the men I admire most in church history believed in that system, which says believer's baptism is not necessary if, as an infant, you have been baptized. But you've got the commandment from God. Forgive me if it seems too simplistic. Believe and be baptized. It's in that order. The commandment is first believe, then be baptized. So even if it doesn't fit into your system, is there not something to be said for just obeying? It may seem to you, too, that baptism has nothing to do with being careful. I mean, the fear of drowning has crossed your mind, right? I mean, a skinny little pastor, you know, with these measly little muscles, what's to say he's going to be able to pick up what he has dropped down, you know? I mean, people have drowned in churches before, have they not? Check the statistics. Perhaps, they never say that in the church, right? They say how many converted, how many baptized. They never tell you how many don't survive the baptism. So maybe it's not intelligent as you count intelligence, and maybe it's not systematic according to your system, and maybe it's not careful as you fear drowning. And so maybe, like crossing the Jordan, it's your first opportunity to do something purely and sheerly because you obey. Maybe it's your first step to do something just bluntly, brazenly obedient. You say, I don't understand it particularly. I don't want to do it. I don't want to get wet in public. I always turn down invitations to pool parties. But God said, do it. I'm going to do it. And there will be a blessing attached to that. I want to show you one thing before we close. In verse 11 of chapter 3, Joshua says to the people, behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing overhead of you into the Jordan. Now, my Hebrew experts tell me that although that's a perfectly legitimate explanation, you can also perfectly legitimately explain it this way. Behold, the ark of the covenant. Period. New sentence. The Lord of all the earth is crossing overhead of you into Jordan. Either way, the ark symbolized God's presence. And as the people were called upon to walk down between the layers of water, or at least up against that one wall of water, as they're called to walk down where people would not go if they were following their wits, they walked by the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant symbolized God's presence. And you know what that tells you? That when you are called to do something out of sheer obedience, you can always count on this, that God will be right there with you. In fact, at the lowest point. The priests were right in the middle. The Ark was right in the middle. And when people were closest to drowning, if the river suddenly stopped misbehaving and flooded again, at the very center of the whole thing, the bottom of the valley, there was God. God was with them. He'll be with you in the baptism tank. He will not let you drown. Chapter 1 says, I will not fail you or forsake you. And the word, remember, literally is, I will not drop you or forsake you. If you can't count on your pastor to pick you out of the water, that's okay. God says, I will not drop you or forsake you. And whether God is calling you to be baptized or whether it's some other area of obedience, is that not in itself incentive to go ahead and take the next step? Whatever that next step is. To realize that when you take that next step, God will be with you in a whole new way. Isn't that the thing we need as Christians? The experience of knowing that God is right with us? I've heard a lot of people say that. If only I sensed God with me in a new way. If only I knew God was right here. Well, you can know that, as Israel knew it, by taking a step of obedience, by daring to get your feet wet, by going ahead and doing everything you can do until you get to that point where it's God's move next. And God will move and show himself to you in a new way. And you'll be strengthened to take the next step, which is quite a step. We'll see that next week and in the weeks ahead as we continue our study of Joshua and see its application to us as we take our steps one by one to living the life that God calls us to live. Let's pray.